A few years ago, I decided to volunteer at a new charity in this town. And because we were new, there weren't a lot of people coming to see us. That changed pretty rapidly. But for the first few sessions, us volunteers had a lot of time to sit around and get to know each other. And so when it came to talking about me, I was talking about how I was getting these lessons together to teach about the Renaissance. And after that, a woman came up to me, my sort of age, very nice woman, and said to me, "So Picasso, is that the Renaissance?" And that just hurt my heart a little bit. And so this is why I'm doing these videos. And today we are going to do the Renaissance. In my view, the greatest art movement of all time. Just extraordinary, the artists that gathered together. Extraordinary that it happened at all. There are other great art movements, of course, Islamic Golden Age, abstract expressionism. But the Renaissance is something so incredible, it's difficult to believe it all happened at the same time. So this video and the next video, I'm going to talk about the Renaissance and where it comes, because I think that's what's so important. You may know the Renaissance, but you may not know where it comes in history. And I'm going to show you some examples of Renaissance art, which I can guarantee you will know some of them, even if you think you know nothing about art history. And then my other great passion is the Baroque, which comes after the Renaissance. And people get even more confused about the Baroque, and I think it's partly to do with the fact it sounds a lot like the art movement that came after it, which is the Rococo. So we have the Renaissance, which lasts over 2 centuries. Can you believe it? That is a long time for art, and obviously has many developments within that time. Then there's Mannerism, which you may well not have heard of. It's quite a sort of funny little obscure art movement. Then there's the Baroque, which we will do next time, and then the Rococo. So, Renaissance, 14th to 16th century. And it comes from the word renaissance, rebirth, and that's the French. In Italian, it's Rinascimento. And the reason it's called rebirth is because it's the rebirth of classical values. And by classical, they mean ancient Roman and ancient Greek. And what was happening, particularly in Rome, in Italy at this time, was a lot of rebuilding was going on. So they were digging up a lot of earth, and in that earth they were finding antique buildings, antique sculptures. And so this is what the rebirth is. The rebirth, the rinascimento, the renaissance of classical values. So because it goes on for so long, there are 3 main sections. So we have the Proto-Renaissance, the Trecento, the 1300s, the early Renaissance, and the main Renaissance, body of the Renaissance, the Quattrocento, that's the 1400s, and the High Renaissance, or Cinquecento, also a car, as I'm sure you know, the 1500s. So, given it's so important to know where the Renaissance comes, what exactly was happening to art between the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance in Europe? And it was the so-called Dark Ages, times of medieval art and architecture. And anything pagan, such as ancient Greek or Roman art, was destroyed or buried, and it all became about religion. And so that's where we were in terms of what was going on, which is why this rebirth was so dramatic. So the influences that were to do with art and architecture just before the Renaissance, we have Gothic art and architecture, if you think of those amazing Gothic cathedrals, and we have also Byzantine art, centered on Istanbul, then called Byzantium, and those are the amazing gilded mosaics that you get in Ravenna and such places. But it was still very much all about the church, and the man, whether it was the worshipper or the artist, had no power whatsoever. And so this is why the Renaissance was so striking, was this, that they rediscovered what had been going on in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and the Greeks had an enormous emphasis on the human body and the perfection of the human body, which is where you get a lot of these nude sculptures from. They created a whole system of architecture that got revived, but it wasn't just the art, it was so much more. Old books were discovered and brought back to Italy, and it became a humanist movement. And with, as you can see from this Leonardo da Vinci drawing, where man was put back at the centre. I mean, obviously not humanist in our view. The church was still very influential, but buildings started to be designed in relation to human proportions. Naked, nude sculptures started being created again. And this idea that the perfection of man became more important than the complete domination of the church is really what the Renaissance is all about, the rebirth. And as we said, it starts with the Trecento, and there's only really one artist to show you, and this is Giotto. So this is really early. Look at 1305 to 1310. This is the very beginning of the Renaissance, and it's Giotto. And he's very simple, but what makes him the beginning of the Renaissance is the perspective. He starts using perspective, and he starts creating characters in real fields, what we would regard as realism. And I will talk more about what went before in the video. I will be doing on this beautiful, beautiful artwork. So Giotto, he's the father of the Renaissance. He would be what you would think of with the Trecento. Then we go into the Quattrocento and the main, early and main body of the Renaissance. And this is Masaccio. And he is Giotto's spiritual, artistic heir. And he takes what Giotto started, which is perspective, to create realistic surroundings, whether they be natural or architectural. You have figures of mass, of realistic scale, standing firmly rooted to the ground, with shadows showing just that. And it's simplicity, but it's also bold and realistic and there. So that's Masaccio. And then of course we have Piero del Francesco, which if you watched my previous video, you would have seen my passion for this fresco. The resurrection of Christ. And here we see classical values on full show. We have the Christ figure with his foot defiantly standing on a Roman sarcophagus, and below him are sleeping Roman soldiers, one of them holding a shield saying SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanum. We have the Renaissance in full swing. And then, of course, as we're getting to the end, we get to see these images that really, really speak to us of the Renaissance. And really, Venus is the poster girl for the Renaissance. Here she is, arriving on her shell. And it's quite a complex painting. It looks quite simple, but it's quite complex. And it looks like she is the poster girl for all the classical values that have been reborn in the Renaissance. And this is an example of what the Venetians were up to, the Bellinis, the Bellini family, the Bellini workshop. If you've been to Venice, I'm sure you've drunk a Bellini. And this is known as a Pietà. So it's the dead figure of Christ being desperately mourned over by his mother and St. John. Then we get to the High Renaissance. We get to the meat, the apex of Renaissance in Italy. And this is very famous, of course. This is what I mean. Even if you don't know what the Renaissance is, you will know some of these images. And this is the creation of Adam from Michelangelo's ceiling in the Sistine Chapel. Then we have probably the most famous painting in the world, the Mona Lisa by Leonardo. a tiny painting, but so beautifully painted. Everything is Gossamer-like, her hair, her clothes, the background. And if you go to the Louvre and see it, if it's still where it was, I haven't been for a while, it's just very strange because you've got this enormous room with this tiny painting at the end and people crowding round and taking photos, don't get me started, of this tiny painting that has become the most famous painting in the world. Well, this is High Renaissance. And the third is Raphael. Raphael, the great charmer, the great courtier. And here he is, again, in the Vatican, painting this incredible scene of the School of Athens. And you could not get more an example of the Renaissance, and particularly the High Renaissance, than this building of all these very famous classical figures, astronomers, mathematicians, philosophers, all recognised, all grouped together in this amazing classical setting. And you can see that the Renaissance is absolutely at its height, at its complete height. To be able to paint a setting like that is just unbelievable, I think. And let's not forget the Venetians, and really the fourth great of the High Renaissance is Titian. And he lived a long time, so there are many paintings by Titian. But this is the Entombment of Christ. And look how far we've moved from the clarity of Masaccio, and now we're into Titian, and those dark shadows. We're almost heading into Baroque with this, almost, but not quite. So let's forget the Venetians. So Titian, absolutely part of the High Renaissance. But the Renaissance is not confined to Italy. This is the incredible thing about it. It was so amazing. It travelled over the Alps, and it travelled to Flanders, Holland, Germany, and even came over here to our dark little backwater that no one wanted to visit. And this is called the Northern Renaissance. Obviously a bit later than the Italian Renaissance. And here again, you are going to recognise some of these scenes. And this is Van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait. And you can see how very different this is to the Italian Renaissance. Yes, there was religious art in the Northern Renaissance until the Reformation started, but there was also more secular art as well. So this is a portrait, a marriage portrait of a couple. And then, as I say, nobody wanted to come over here. We'd broken with Rome, so there was no more religious art. So what kind of art was left to us? Well, portraiture. And so we had to pay people to come over here, and Holbein came over here and painted and drew the most exquisite portraits. Following the Renaissance, we get Mannerism. Now, Mannerism is, as I said, quite a sort of strange little art movement. Every art movement either responds to or reacts against what went before. And the Renaissance was about classical values, about proportions relating to man, about realism, about calm, about geometry. Mannerisms decides to go a different way. And here we have things that become unrealistic, in quotes again. But if you want to remember Mannerism, probably the easiest way to remember it is to think of El Greco, who you probably know, with his very elongated figures. So this is El Greco. So that's Mannerism, just extremes, the Renaissance. They don't want any more of this calm, rational rebirth of classical values. They want to go their own way with their own passions, and so they do. And so there we have it, a little taster of the Renaissance, followed by Mannerism. And in the next video, I will be looking at the Baroque and Rococo. I really hope that spoke to you and has given you a little idea of what the Renaissance is. And look, not a Picasso among them.